Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm filming my January reading wrap up. So I've read 10 books so far this year, 6 of which were 5-star, 1 4-star, 2 3 stars and 1 2-star. So far it's been a crazy strong start to the year. I also have one book that I DNF'd that I will be talking about first, just to get it out of the way. So the book I DNF'd was The Dog Stars by Peter Heller. I DNF'd it at the 40-page mark, which I think represents all of about 10% of the book. The big reason I DNF'd this, so this is post-apocalyptic fiction, which is normally like right up my alley. So it's actually on one of my 5-star predictions lists, so the fact that I've DNF'd it is quite sad in some ways. But the big reason is because it is written entirely in like a stream of consciousness style without any speech marks, and it's just one sort of long fluid rant is the wrong word, but yes, stream of consciousness, and that's just a style of writing that I personally really dislike. And had I actually known that it was this style of stream of consciousness, I never would have bought it in the first place. This is kind of on me for not checking the book before picking it up. I'm sure the story is great, but I don't personally like that way of conveying stories, so I'm just gonna abandon it because there are more books on my shelf that I'm more excited about. Okay, now I'm going to go in order of 5-star all the way down to 2-star because it's more fun to talk about books that I had a good time with, and I'll save my angry rant for the end as a treat for anyone who makes it that far. Also, the first 3 books of the year that I read were all 5 stars, so it seems nice to start that way. The first book I read is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and this is by Toshikazu Kawaguchi and was translated by Jeffrey Truslow. This was such a beautiful book to start the year with. I've actually, since finishing it, already lent it to one of my friends at work who finished it and it made her cry, and I've now immediately lent it to my dad, which is why I don't have a copy of it, because I want everyone in the world to just read this book. It's so beautiful. The basic premise is it is set in a coffee shop where there is a particular seat where if you sit in it you are able to travel back in time. However, there are several rules attached to this ability. First of all, you're not allowed to leave the seat that you're in, which means you can only travel back to that particular coffee shop. You can only meet people who you've already met. Nothing you do will change the future, so therefore, or the present, so you can't have any lasting impacts, and you only have the length of time it takes before the coffee you're drinking gets cold, otherwise you'll be trapped as a ghost. And from that point it's kind of a series of little vignettes about the various characters that come to the coffee shop and the different reasons why they go back, and really it's a story about missed opportunities, second chances, and like the ways that we communicate with our loved ones and having an opportunity to say things that hadn't been said. It was absolutely beautiful and just so like heart-wrenching in so many places. It's really, it's the kind of book that just feels like a hug, like it just reaffirms your belief in the goodness of humanity, and it's just such a lovely book, and I would really recommend it. It's quite short, it's only 200 pages. It's absolutely amazing. Then I read Wildin by Isabella. This is a non-fiction that looks at the process of wilding or rewilding habitats specifically in the UK. So Isabella and her husband inherited a farm, and they worked that farm in like the classic intensive farming style that currently a lot of farmers use, but it just wasn't economically viable for them. So at a particular point they decided to try and give wilding a go, and it was their experiences with this, working with local conservation groups, local governments, impacts from EU regulations and all sorts of things like that. Really fascinating book. I listened to it on audiobook, and I think Isabella narrates it herself, and she has a lovely, it really straddles that line between putting forward a particular point without getting overly preachy with it and overly intense with it, and it was a lovely mix of some kind of hard science and stuff to do with also like hard politics, like government policy on these issues, also mixed in with some really lovely nature writing. So it was both a kind of mixture of like super educational but also just like pleasant to read about otters and beavers coming back. The process of rewilding is basically where you give back the land to nature, and encouraged by using introducing a couple of keystone species to try and recreate biodiversity. And she talks about all the different kind of issues surrounding this and a lot of the controversies, because it is quite a controversial topic within conservation about how effective it is or isn't. I would really recommend this book if you're into if you are concerned about climate change and want to read about something that's a little bit more hopeful, if you like nature writing and if you like science, especially things like botany and biology. I think it's absolutely stunning as a book and might become one of my favourites this year. Very bold to say that this early, but might be. The next book I read was Packing for Mars by Mary Roach. Now this is the third book by Mary Roach that I've read, and I feel like I am confident in saying that she is a favourite author now, especially one of my favourite non-fiction authors. This is the science behind life in space, or life in the void, as the title on the front suggests, and it's just looking at all the different quirky and fun experiments that groups like NASA have to do to try and work out various problems that we're confronted with in space. It looks at kind of like the space race historically, but also does a lot of work looking at like what NASA is worrying about in the future, some of the concerns we have about this idea of like we could move to Mars and why a lot of these things aren't viable. Maybe we should just save our own planet and not like try and screw off to another one. But yeah, the whole thing absolutely fascinating and fantastic. Takeaway message is just space is really, really gross, and if you're not into things that discuss bodily fluids a lot, don't read this book. But yes, this is absolutely amazing. Then my next 5-star read was The Turn of Midnight by Minette. So this is part 2 of a duology. It's her Black Death series, and it's historical fiction set in the time of the Black Plague. So I can't say a crazy amount much about this particular book because obviously it is part 2, but I just want to say that I deeply enjoyed book 1, and I think Minette Walters' strongest point is like her characters. They are so well rounded and fleshed out and really intense as people, and I think it's just she does such a good job not only with her main cast of characters, which was quite big, but all of the secondary and even tertiary ones were like fully fleshed out people who have their own character arcs going on, which is kind of why this book ended up being split into 2. I feel like she dedicates so much space to being able to explore these human relationships that from an actual plot point, I'm pretty sure Minette Walters could have done this entire like duology in one book, and like one probably like 400-page book at that, rather than 2 500 to 600-page books. But it was the kind of thing that I didn't mind the sort of sprawling, meandering, quite slow pace to it, because I really enjoyed all the characters we were going along with. I think it ties itself up quite nicely. I was very concerned about whether it was ever going to be able to actually end, because it's such a difficult thing to wrap up when you're talking about something as big as the Black Death, but it did so quite nicely. The only thing that I really wish there had been slightly more of is the romance aspect of it. There is a very, very slight romance between some of the main characters, 2 of the main characters in particular, and like you kind of know that they're probably a done deal, but I wanted slightly more. There was only the faintest hint of like a couple of fleeting glances and like a brushing of a hand, and I know that this is historical fiction and it's not going for that like historical romance, so I wasn't expecting a bodice ripper, but I really just wanted a little bit more of a payoff, because Slow Burn doesn't even get close to how slow of a burn this one is, and it never had that big moment to kind of satisfy. But from a just historical fiction perspective, absolutely incredible. Another 5-star read of mine was The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, and this is another one that I've already lent to my dad because of how much I enjoyed this. I ended up buddy reading it with Pauline from Dancing Lawn. I'll link her channel down below, and I had such a good time, and I think she did too from what we've been chatting about over Twitter Messenger. The Midwich Cuckoos is 1950s sci-fi, and it is about a village that all of a sudden overnight they just like everybody passes out for like 24 hours and total blackout, and then when they wake back up they find out a couple of like weeks / months later that every woman who is like physically able to be is pregnant all at the same time. They all give birth to these really, really weird kids with like golden eyes, which kind of have a bit of a like they grow too quickly and they're far too intelligent, and there's a bit of an insidious potential alien invasion thing going on. As far as I'm aware, the movie Children of the Damned and things like that are based off of this, and John Wyndham is such a like fantastic, iconic vintage sci-fi writer. He reminds me so much of H.G. Wells, and as anybody who's been on my channel for a while knows, I adore H.G. Wells writing. It was such a good time, and I'm so pleased I enjoyed it so much, because there's another like 5 or 6 books by Wyndham that I totally want to read. It was really fun playing around with this far more like insidious creeping in kind of invasion, rather than the like guns blazing like tank kind of level invasion that things like War of the Worlds do. And I just think he played around with some really, really interesting ideas and talked in quite a fun, expansive way about some of the like politics and social and like philosophical implications of what he was doing, and that was all in the book. So that was really nice to read, rather than having some of the sci-fi out there that like alludes to these things and then lets the reader just ponder themselves. Sometimes it's nice to just have it written down and like to talk about all the big themes in the book itself. So really, really fun, and some amazingly funny scenes as well. Absolutely loved it. And then my final 5-star read was Lab Girl by Jahren, and this is a memoir about a paleobotanist who, it's a mixture of discussing plants and plant science and what plants can do basically, and then also her memoir of her travels becoming a scientist. It was a very intense read in places. Hope suffered from a couple of different mental health things along the way, and that wasn't signposted before going in, and was quite jarring as we just sort of kind of slammed into a few chapters of that and then came back out the other side. That's not necessarily a criticism of it, because I do think that, you know, that was how she experienced it in her life. Things were kind of going okay, and then she's just sort of hit these moments of real trauma, which it was interesting to experience that as reading. And I do think like that more jarring approach that is outside of my frame of reference is very important as a reader, but it's just something to be aware of. Also, just from a personal perspective, I would have really enjoyed more of the plant science, like even more so, because I'm a massive nerd who generally is not that bothered by the memoir aspect. But from the memoir side of things, it was really fascinating understanding things like the process of becoming an academic and a research scientist, the concerns about funding, how she deals with those things, how you deal with things like she's a woman in a space mainly dominated by men, and various discussions about that I found very, very enlightening as well. So I really appreciated a lot of those aspects, and it just was really beautiful to read. She has such a wonderful way with words, and it's so clearly like her passion for plants is just incredible, and the paleobotany aspect about learning how plants have been around for so long and how they've managed to do that, and then ties in with more of the paleontology side of things, is a whole subsection of like paleo history that I hadn't even twigged about, and was like, I'm so psyched about it. I definitely need to go and read more books, because it was fascinating in its own right. And everybody knows on this channel I like paleo stuff. Me likes the old things. Dinos are right up my street, but actually let's get some old plants in here as well. Let's just expand my old horizons to cover more. So those are all the really good ones. Then I'm going to talk about my 4-star next. So this is Leviathan by Scott Westerfield, which is a YA sci-fi alternative history, I believe. Scott Westerfield wrote Uglies, which is probably the thing that he's most well known for. I didn't really like Uglies when I read it as a teenager, but I had such good fun with Leviathan. Leviathan is an alternative universe focused on the First World War, where there is a divide on more of like an ideological aspect, where countries like Britain have really embraced Darwin's theories and are Darwinists, and basically use genetic engineering to modify creatures, and that's where all of their tech comes from. It's a really cool idea, done very, very well. Like the airship that a lot of the book takes place on is one gigantic, like weird whale, bird, ton of other species hybrid, and it's awesome. So from that side of things, loved that. The other side of the divide, focused on like Germany, is they're called clankers, and they're basically super into their like traditional tech, but going with a very steampunk influence. So you've got these two ideologies clashing. The book follows two main characters. We have the Archduke's son. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and that's what kind of triggers the First World War genuinely in our world, and it's his son. They've made Scott's kind of done some twists on that storyline to make it kind of work, and he's an heir who he's on the run basically to keep himself safe. And then it also has our main character Devlin, who is a young woman who wants to become like a pilot, or I think they call them aeronauts, and she is masquerading as a boy to enter the aeronaut school. And then at some point, as with all of these YA things, their paths collide, entertaining things happen. It is part of a trilogy. It's not the most satisfying end to a first book, because there's so clearly more stuff to come, and whilst there is kind of an overarching plot into this first book, it's more of doing a lot of setup. But with a world building this strong, I'm 100% happy with that. From like a plot and character perspective, it is falling into a lot of those YA tropes, but it's doing them relatively well, and I don't really care as long as we keep talking about more of these weird Darwinist creatures. So I'm probably going to continue with the series, and I had way more fun this book than I was expecting walking in. It was great. Okay, then we have two 3-star reads. So the first one is The Odyssey by Homer, but particularly the edition translated by Emily Wilson. This translation has been creating a few waves recently because it is the first time that the Odyssey has been translated by a woman and a female scholar, and it is about interesting her take on it and compared to a lot of the gender biases in the past, specifically focusing on how women's roles are translated within it, whether, you know, they are referred to as slaves or wives or mistresses or prostitutes or concubines, and it's all very interesting. She has a whole section about it in the introduction. The reason this was like a proper mid-range 2.5 to 3 star read is because basically the Odyssey just isn't that interesting. Sorry, classics nerds, like, come at me if you want in the comments and we can talk about it, but from like a purely reader, like modern day reader with zero interest in studying it, it's a little bit dull. The Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus and his travels back from the Trojan War and his attempts to try and get home. His household has been taken over by suitors who are trying to marry his wife and basically eating and drinking all of his wealth, and it's a combination of like his adventures and then him coming back and dealing with the fact that they are there and trying to plot to overthrow them. From like a purely narrative perspective, I enjoyed when he got back home far more because it was far more structured and linear and actually felt like it had an overarching plot to it. His journeys out in the sea was just a series of disjointed, and then we landed on this island and did this, and the whole thing really felt like a kid's bedtime story that the parent was constantly tacking on the next episode and the next episode. This is not the fault of the Odyssey. It's a very old book that is dealing with like a lot of like, you know, setting the stage, and there's all sorts of interactions between the written tradition and the oral tradition, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you can study about it, but just purely from a non-studying perspective, I would not necessarily recommend that you actually go out and read this. Maybe just read one of the many adaptations out there, or watch a movie, I don't know. But it was still interesting to have ticked this box and done it, and I really did enjoy Emily Wilson's introduction talking about the history of the Odyssey and Homer and its interactions with academia, so from that perspective I really appreciated it. My other 3-star read is The Illusionist Apprentice by Kristy Cambron. This is a YA historical magic-y book? Yeah, sure, we'll go with that. And it tells the tale of Ren, who was Houdini's apprentice. So there's a guy who's trying to bring back the dead, and I can't remember the name for it, like this sort of spiritualist time that was really big in the Victorian era, but his act goes terribly wrong, and the FBI needs to talk with Ren about her connections with it, and then it sort of becomes a bit of a chase from there. The reason why this was only a 3-star is because it was just so generic in its writing and reading experience. It was perfectly adequate, but give me 2 months and I will not remember this book. It was just some very bland, stereotypical characters bouncing through some very bland, stereotypical plot points with very, very clunky writing. There was a romance between the main FBI guy and Ren, because of course there was. Ren has a torture past, because of course she does. The torture past turns out to be not that dramatic, because of course it isn't. And the whole thing just kind of continues from there. What I was really, really hoping for was a lot of information about the magic side of things, and I really wanted Kristy to have done some serious research about how magic works in the Victorian era. I was thinking like the movie The Prestige, but in book form, and maybe a little bit more passed down, and it really just didn't deliver. Like, Ren's magic is not believable because it isn't grounded in any reality, and we never really get to peek behind the curtain. The most she does is pick some locks with some cufflinks that are disguised as actually lockpicks. Like, it's super, super dull, and I was just really pleased when it was done. Like, it was just meh, really. And now we're on to the rant, because we're on to my 2-star read. Being generous with 2-star here. Honestly, the more I think about it, might even push down to 1 star. And that is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. If you have been around in the book world for a while, you will know who Stieg Larsson is. He is of the Millennium Falcon trilogy fame. Stieg Larsson, this book was very, very popular a while ago, and it is a Scandinavian crime thriller. I didn't really know a crazy amount going into this, but I have a lot of issues with this book on a lot of different sort of levels of it. First of all, I just don't think it's a very good thriller. The reason being is I think it's actually trying to be 3 separate thrillers crammed into 1 book. At the beginning, you have this like financial crisis and kind of like underhanded financial corporate espionage kind of plot going on, and that was kind of interesting in its own right. Then we sideline that for some kind of missing girl thing that's going on. And that again was kind of vaguely interesting in its own right. I'm going to talk full spoilers, by the way, about this book, so if you're not interested about this, end the video now and just expect that like just know that I didn't enjoy it, and I'll see you whenever. But full spoilers time now. Then when we're discovering this missing girl thing, we stumble straight into some kind of like psychopath's murderer's den that came out of nowhere and was a weird twist that had not been signposted, and honest to God was just because like I'm a firm believer that Stieg Larsson just didn't know where he was going with it. Then we wrap up the weird missing girl thing, then we tack on a bunch of financial crap at the end, and honestly, very, very dull. Not one of these 3 plots could have been a thriller in its own right, like, because there wasn't enough there. But if Stieg Larsson had actually separated them out and taken one of them and bothered to really develop it, I think it would have been a much stronger book than just smashing them all together. So that was one of the reasons why I didn't like it. Like, there was a middle section when we were doing the missing girl case where I was really invested, and I was kind of keen on the like kind of weird financial stuff, and was really bummed out when we left it behind at the beginning. And then as soon as this like psycho out of nowhere came in, I was like, oh god, you don't know what you're doing, you can't end this, like you're just throwing everything in that you can possibly think about, and I'm bored now. Then we have the fact that Stieg Larsson really at heart is just a deep misogynist, and that was truly, truly frustrating. Just this overarching layer of women hating that I really struggled with on many sections. Apparently the working title for this book was Men Hating Women, so there's a little bit of a no shit going on when we walk into this one, but that still doesn't excuse it. So we have the fact that all of the male characters are written very well. All of the female characters are two-dimensional, flat, and frankly terrible. Lisbeth, the main female protagonist character, reads like a robot. I can't tell exactly what Stieg Larsson's trying to do, but a lot of her behaviour is coded in such a way that it kind of implies that she might have something like autism or Asperger's or anything like that, but it's never really explicitly stated, which means that Stieg Larsson has the wonderful ability to like paint his character to be a total robot, therefore not doing representation very well for anybody who might want to be represented. Any of this behaviour could be potentially considered like a stereotypical view of this, but by not actually explicitly labelling her as anything in particular, he can get out of the fact that he hasn't done any good representation, because hey, you're the one assuming it, not him, and he never said that. So if it's bad representation, that's on you for assuming that that's representation. But hey, I don't have to write like a nuanced character in any meaningful way, because I can hide behind these really robotic terms and everything's completely fine, until it comes to the sex scenes, and then Elizabeth is going to turn into like some proper little hoe in the corner in a way that she's never done in the rest of it. Entirely gratuitous rape scene super early on, be aware of that, interspersed with a consensual sex scene. What the fuck is that about? Like paragraph after paragraph we've got rape scene, consensual sex, rape scene, consensual sex with different characters, and like that's not a thing that I need. Elizabeth is described looking like a 14-year-old girl repeatedly. Mate, deal with this. Like, you sit, what is that? Like, I don't want to listen about her prepubescent boobs and then you go on to a sex scene with her next. It's really fucking weird. The amount of like detail put into any of the descriptions of women being in pain or in any kind of trauma, again, the fuck? Like, this isn't your therapy session, bro. Like, this just felt so gratuitous and voyeuristic and trying to live vicariously through his characters, and I hated so much of it, and it just made me feel so dirty reading it. And honestly, the reasons why it's getting like the inkling of a 2-star rather than a 1 is the male characters are really good, so you clearly can do it if the person in question identifies as a man. And I genuinely was really into some of the like financial side of things in the missing girl storyline, and I thought that there was the inkling of a good thriller in there, but it just, the rest of it was so bad. If you've read this book and you have similar opinions, please let me know, because this was hugely popular, like hugely popular in its time, and I can't understand why. Why would anyone go on to read the other 2 books? Why would you submit yourself to that? Good lord. And I don't know if it comes from like a time period thing, because this was popular like probably about 15 years ago now, but even so, like, come on, there are better thrillers out there. But yeah, so to end on a low note, that's what I thought of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Generally this month has been super strong for reading, and I'm really excited about a lot of things I've got going on in February, so fingers crossed we can continue the good books coming along and avoid crap like Stieg Larsson again in the future. Okay, cool. That's it from me. any and all comments down below. You know the drill. Subscribe if you want to. You've been on YouTube. You know how this thing works by now. And I will see you soon. Have a wonderful reading week. Bye, guys.